Well, Paul specifically said, ignore people who say that Jesus has come back.
Well, the funny thing about that is when Paul wrote that, it was in 51, maybe 52 AD. Okay. So my date for the book of Revelation is 63 AD. So this is at least, 12 years before he even writes the book of Revelation. But here's the interesting thing with that. Why would Paul even have to tell the Thessalonians that Jesus hadn't come back yet? I mean, if every eye is going to see him, right? If this big eye popping thing, you can't miss him. The clouds are being rolled back like a scroll, and here he is coming on the clouds, and you got these loud trumpets going off everywhere. Why is Paul telling him, hey, don't be alarmed by some report coming from us saying that the day of the Lord has already happened? Do you follow
Because
me on that?
because the preconceived ideas of even saying Jesus came back didn't exist yet. So for these people to be able to manipulate the church, it would have to mean literally that every preconceived idea that anyone between us or now listening has about what that day even entails would have to be wrong.
Exactly.
Because you wouldn't have to explain away zombies coming from the ground.
Right.
You wouldn't have to explain away something that every single eye will see and every knee will bow to. You wouldn't have to explain that away.
In Timothy, they're talking about the resurrection as having already occurred as well. So if the resurrection is dead bodies coming up out of the grave, why is Paul having to even say, hey, don't worry. How are they shipwrecking? How Hymenaeus and how are they shipwrecking the faith of many, or some rather?
How would that be possible? Exactly.
Yes.
And I think because this is the most common rebuttal that people have, or I also think it is their biggest undoing, or us and them. No, that's not what I mean. But I just mean, like, in general, this is probably the biggest argument for the case because it's the most easily represented way to explain. This is Paul quoting somebody and you're quoting Paul. This is third-party quotes. So you don't even know what these two guys are even saying when you quote Paul as he quotes them. Right? So I think this is one of the biggest ways. This is probably how I've been able to explain to people to at least open a little bit like an onion, take that first layer, is by just simply explaining that this is a window into a window of what they're saying. This is literally third-party quotes. And exactly what you said. If all of these preconceived ideas were the way it actually is going to happen, you would not need to explain that away. It would be so apparent that people would they would laugh at them the way we laugh at people who claim Jesus has already come. Because it doesn't make sense, right? With the imagery in our head. So how about this? Then what were they actually saying? What was Paul actually quoting these men were doing when they said the resurrection? Because we're going back to that pictorial language.
Okay. So first of all, going back to Ezekiel 37, there's that valley of dry bones, right? And what does God tell Ezekiel it is? This is the whole house of Israel. And Ezekiel asked he asked Ezekiel that question, can these bones live? And Ezekiel, they're in exile at that time, which means they're dead. That's how they looked at being in exile. It was death. You were out of the presence, outside the presence of God. You're not near the temple. So he's telling them that the resurrection, the regathering of Israel is going to occur. And with this regathering of the whole house of Israel, as you read further in Ezekiel 37, that God's going to bring the whole house of Israel together, and he's going to do it under this King David figure. Go figure. So everybody thinks Israel was regathered in 1948, and ooh, this is a big one too. But God actually regathered Israel through the church. And that is another misconception of things that are going on.
If you're talking to Orthodox Jews,
Mm-hmm.
what has stopped them from the only way that would even make sense is if they themselves even lost a lot through translation in the pictorial language. Because I don't even think the history of Israel, both modern and historical, like I don't think almost anybody actually understands, and I think the vast majority of people are way too willing to accept and afraid to even start that conversation, right? So when you say 1947, let's start there. I don't think most people even realize the nation, right? The state of Israel was established in 1947 because it was disbanded, right? With the destruction of Jerusalem, which you're arguing was what Revelations was about,
Yes,
which also mentioned Rome quite a lot, which makes sense because they were occupied by the Romans, and that was the whole point of all of it, right? Is Orthodox Jews believed that Jesus would be a militaristic figure and free them, right? From so.
So let me walk you through why I say that they were regathered under Jesus. Okay, the Ezekiel 37 is one, Jeremiah 31 is another, but I'm going to take you all the way back to Genesis. So when Israel is about to bless Joseph's two sons, he puts his hands on the younger one and is about to bless him, and Joseph tries to stop him. No, no, no. Here's the older one. He said, yeah, there's going to be a blessing for him too. But he says about Ephraim, his seed. When you read the Hebrew, it says his seed is the fullness of the nations, and that same word nations is the word Gentiles. So where have we heard fullness of the Gentiles before? Romans 11:25, where it talks about uh, when the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. Okay, so what's going on here? So remember, after David dies, or Solomon, after Solomon dies, the kingdom is split. And the 10 northern tribes become known as Ephraim or Israel. The 2 southern tribes become known as Judah. So the 10 northern tribes end up getting assimilated into the nations or into the Gentiles by the Assyrians. Hosea 8:8, Hosea 1 talks about that. I'm divorcing you. But Hosea 2 comes back and says, I'm going to remarry you at some point. Hosea 8 tells us that Ephraim was swallowed up among the nations or among the Gentiles. Again, they've been totally dispersed, and Jason Staples does a great job of explaining this. Okay, so now we've got the northern tribes are gone. You got the 2 southern tribes that are faithful. Babylon comes in and pretty much assimilates them as well. But then all of Israel gets to come back, in a sense, to Jerusalem. So we're going on there waiting for this Messiah figure to come. Jesus comes on the scene. And what does he tell his disciples? Go and make disciples of all the nations. And he tells them where to start. In Jerusalem, then to Judea, then to Samaria, then to the ends of the ends of the earth. So in this process of going and gathering people all over the Roman Empire, essentially, because that was the known world at that time, the oikoumene, Paul stops at the synagogue every time. It's his first stop. And it talks about how some of them become Christians and not even a few Greeks. So the Gentiles are starting to come in as well. Finally, they have this big discussion on this in Acts chapter 15. And Paul's talking about how the Gentiles are coming into the kingdom. And here's a really interesting quote by James. He said that David's fallen tent, he's quoting Amos chapter 9, David's fallen tent is being restored. Whoa, wait a minute. Gentiles are coming in. They, along with Judah coming in, is David's fallen tent being restored? How is that? Because through Ephraim being dispersed into the rest of the nations, when they come back in, you're bringing Ephraim in, but you're also bringing the Gentiles in, which is fulfillment of Isaiah 49:6. It's not enough for me to gather or for you to bring Israel and Judah back together, but you're going to bring the Gentiles in as well when he's talking about Jesus. And what did Ezekiel 37 tell us? All of this was going to happen under this David type figure. So what's going on through the gospel being spread is that the church is regathering Israel together into this new Israel. It's a second Exodus motif. The first Exodus, what happened? Moses came, gave the law. Jesus gives the Beatitudes. Moses leads them in the desert for 40 years. The church goes into this period of 40 years, the already but not yet, until 70 AD, from 30 AD to 70 AD. There's this coexistence of old Israel and young Israel, the church, just like what happened with the 40 years of wandering in the desert. And what happened then? Old Israel died off, young Israel went forward into the promised land. What happened after AD 70? Old Israel died off, young Israel, the church, goes forward into the promised land. It's a second Exodus motif. When Jesus is there with Moses and Elijah, he's uh, one of the words in talking about his departure, the word for departure in Greek is Exodus. So Jesus, in talking about his death, is talking about his exodus. He's leaving. And his body was then to go, the church was to undergo that second Exodus period. And you find second Exodus language all over the place. If you look through the book of Revelation, what do those plagues remind you of? The plagues of Exodus. Moses and Elijah appear in chapter 11. What's going on there? The law and the prophets. Think about the law and the prophets. When Jesus was transfigured before them, Moses and Elijah disappeared. What was remaining? Jesus. The law and the prophets were now going to take second seat to Jesus, who was going to go forward. The law and the prophets were leading us to Jesus. That's that whole point with the transfiguration. Because Peter wants to build shelters, right, for Moses and Elijah and for Jesus, and they disappear. And the only one remaining is Jesus, showing that the old covenant was about to disappear and this new covenant was going forward. Hebrews 8:13. What has been made obsolete will soon vanish and disappear. Everybody thinks the old covenant ended at the cross, but it did not. It was the beginning of the process of it ending, but it did not end. I said a lot.
Yeah, it's great. No, it's fantastic. What does it matter? Revelations is about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not about the end times of the world. What does that even matter? Our behavior shouldn't change anyway.
It shouldn't, but here's the good news about why it matters. Thinking back to the feast days, we know what was fulfilled in 30. Jesus fulfilled Passover. He fulfilled the feast, started fulfilling the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at least anyway, removing the sin from us. And then on first fruits of the barley harvest, he rose that Sunday. Then you have Pentecost. So the church is born on Pentecost. It's the first fruits of that wheat harvest. Okay. So that left the three major feasts that were left: Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and Feast of Tabernacles. So why does it matter? What was the most important sacrifice every year for them? It was the Day of Atonement sacrifices. So the cross was Passover. It allowed the judgment of God to pass over his new firstborn, which is Jesus and his body, which is what the whole idea of uh, today I've begotten you, today I've become your father, that whole sentence, and then quoted from the Psalms and is in Hebrews, and I think in Acts 13 as well, perhaps. It's all about Jesus being the first son in this new creation, in the new kingdom. That's why today I've become your father. It wasn't that he wasn't his father all along. But today I've become your father in this new. He is first. Colossians 1 makes that clear. He is preeminent in everything. So the Passover allowed the firstborn of God to be passed over, whereas the firstborn of Egypt and Israel becomes Egypt. As you look in Revelation, all of these things that are going on, the plagues and stuff, are coming on Israel, on Jerusalem, Judah, who is what's left of Israel. And that firstborn is now being died. Is going to die with the destruction of Jerusalem. So that's what's going on with the Passover. But the Day of Atonement, what had to happen for them to know that those sacrifices were accepted? For them to know that God was okay with them? The high priest had to come out of the most holy place. So Jesus' return, what we don't understand is the high priest coming out of the true most holy place, which is heaven, showing that when he destroyed that temple, like he said, that was his second coming. You would see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. Anytime God the Father came on clouds in the Old Testament, he was coming in judgment against the nation. Isaiah 13 against Babylon. 19, I think, as well. Against anytime you see I'm coming on the clouds in the Old Testament, he's coming in judgment against the nation. So when Jesus told them in front of that Sanhedrin, that court that they had before they crucified him, that in the future you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, they understood what he was saying. Number one, he was saying he's God. Number two, he was saying that he's coming in judgment against them, and that was it. You've equated yourself with God, and you're saying you're going to destroy this. Who do you think you are? We are God's people. So his return, destroying the temple just as he said he was, proved, as Hebrews talks about in 9 and 10, he can't be our high priest as long as that temple, the current temple, and that system is still standing. Because those priests are currently offering the sacrifices every day. So Jesus can't be our priest until that system is done away with. And that's the whole point. When it was done away with, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15, what's the sting of death? It's sin. And what's the sting of sin or strength of sin? It's the law. So when the law was removed, the sting of death, sin death, was removed, and his power was removed. Satan's head was crushed. His power, the power he held over us, being able to accuse us because of sin, was totally done away with. The sacrifice had been accepted by the Father. It had been shown. And now we can tabernacle with God. That's the Feast of Trumpets being fulfilled. We can now tabernacle. The dwelling of God is with men. Revelation 21. That city is a perfect square. The temple, the city, they're all the same thing. They're all one image. The mountain, the temple, the city, the bride. It's a perfect square. The only square building that we know of was the most holy place. Inside of there, what's it saying? That whole area, the whole territory is now the most holy place. We're in the presence of God. Only the high priest was able to be in the presence of God, and that only once a year. With Jesus destroying the temple, that's why it says, I saw a new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, because the old one has been destroyed. And I saw a new heaven and earth. Josephus tells us in the Antiquities chapter 3 that the old heaven and earth had to do with the temple. It was the place where heaven met earth. So when that temple was destroyed, the new heaven and earth, the church, the kingdom, whatever metaphor you want, it's all talking about the kingdom. Daniel 2, he's going to establish a kingdom that will never, ever be destroyed.
What's going on, guys? If you like that clip right there, you will love the full interview. You can check that out right there. I'll see you on the next video. Oh, and subscribe, because we got a lot of big things coming up in the near future.